My name is Dora, and I'm 64 years old. For 40 years, this Victorian mansion has been my sanctuary, filled with memories of laughter, love, and the life I built with my husband Frank. Every room tells a story. Every corner holds a piece of my heart. I never imagined that the daughter I raised within these walls would one day look me in the eye and tell me my home was disgusting. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear how this story completely changed my life. Trust me, you won't see this twist coming. I became a widow 8 years ago when Frank lost his battle with cancer. The grief nearly broke me, but this house kept me grounded. It's a 12-bedroom Victorian mansion in Connecticut, spanning 8,000 square feet, with 3 acres of gardens that Frank and I tended together for decades. The property is worth about $2.8 million, inherited from Frank's family generations ago. My daily routine became simple after Frank passed. I wake at 6:30, make coffee in the kitchen, where we shared countless morning conversations, and tend to the garden where his ashes rest beneath the old oak tree. I volunteer at the local library 3 days a week, helping elderly residents with computer classes. My social security and small pension cover my modest needs, though maintaining such a large property certainly stretches the budget. My daughter Sarah is 35, now married to Marcus, who's 38. They live in a cramped townhouse 20 minutes away, with my 2 precious grandchildren, Kyle, who's 12, and Emma, who's 9. Sarah works part-time as a dental assistant, while Marcus has been struggling to find steady employment since losing his job at the insurance company 6 months ago. In recent months, I noticed Sarah's demeanor changing during our weekly visits. Her usual warmth was replaced by a distant politeness that made me uneasy. She'd walk through the house with calculating eyes, commenting on the outdated wallpaper, or pointing out where the hardwood floors showed wear. Her complaints about their financial struggles became more frequent, often accompanied by pointed remarks about how expensive it must be to heat such a large home. Last month, Sarah suggested I consider downsizing for the first time. She spoke in gentle tones about how much work the house required, how lonely I must be rattling around in all those empty rooms. I brushed off her concerns, explaining that this house connected me to Frank and held 40 years of our shared history. Her response was cooler than usual. A simple nod, followed by an uncomfortable silence that stretched between us like a growing chasm. The seeds of doubt were planted during those conversations. Sarah's questions about utility bills and maintenance costs felt invasive, as if she was conducting some sort of financial audit of my life. When I offered to help with their mortgage payments, her refusal seemed almost angry. She insisted that wasn't a sustainable solution, that I needed to think about my own future. Her words carried an undertone I couldn't quite identify, but made my stomach twist with unease. The first real confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah arrived unannounced, with Marcus both carrying serious expressions that immediately put me on edge. They settled in the living room, where Frank used to read his newspapers, and Sarah launched into what felt like a rehearsed speech about my living situation. Marcus had prepared a folder, thick with documents. Real estate listings for senior communities with names like Golden Years Estates and Sunset Manor. The brochures featured smiling elderly people playing cards and doing watercolor paintings, living what the marketing called carefree lifestyles. Sarah explained how these facilities would provide social interaction, prepared meals, and maintenance-free living that would be so much better for someone my age. The pressure felt suffocating as they outlined their plan for my future. Sarah spoke about how I could enjoy my golden years instead of worrying about leaky faucets and heating bills. Marcus chimed in with statistics about the rising costs of home ownership and the benefits of having equity freed up for travel and entertainment. They had clearly researched every angle, preparing responses to objections they anticipated I might raise. What disturbed me most was how they involved Kyle and Emma in their campaign. During their next visit, my grandchildren asked carefully worded questions about why I didn't want to live somewhere fun where I could make new friends. Their innocent queries revealed coaching, and I realized Sarah had been preparing them to help convince me to abandon the home where they'd spent countless holidays and summer afternoons. The children's involvement crossed a line for me. Using Kyle and Emma to manipulate my emotions felt calculated and cruel. When I told Sarah I wasn't ready to make such a drastic change, her mask of concern slipped slightly. Her voice carried a sharp edge when she called me unreasonable and accused me of being stubborn for no good reason. The accusation stung because it ignored the deep emotional connection I had to this place. As autumn progressed, the visits became weapons in an undeclared war. Sarah would arrive with new evidence about why I should move, pointing out a squeaky floorboard here or a draft from an old window there. She'd mention how much money I was wasting on property taxes and suggest I was being selfish by holding on to such a large house when young families needed homes. Her arguments felt designed to make me feel guilty for wanting to stay in my own home. The emotional distance between us grew with each visit. Sarah's hugs became perfunctory, her smiles forced. She stopped asking about my volunteer work or sharing stories about the children's activities. Our conversations centered exclusively on her agenda to relocate me as if every other aspect of my life had become irrelevant. I found myself dreading her calls, knowing each one would bring another angle of attack on my resolve to stay put. The isolation began to wear on me. Sarah started limiting my time with Kyle and Emma, citing their busy school schedules whenever I suggested visits. I suspected she was using my grandchildren as leverage, subtly punishing me for refusing to cooperate with her plans. The house that had always felt full of love and warmth started to echo with loneliness, exactly as Sarah had predicted it would. The campaign intensified after Thanksgiving, when Sarah and Marcus requested what they called a family meeting. They arrived with laptop spreadsheets and a sense of urgency that made me feel like I was being backed into a corner. Marcus had calculated exactly how much money I would save annually by moving into assisted living, down to estimates for reduced utility bills and eliminated maintenance costs. Their presentation was thorough and relentless. Sarah had researched the average lifespan of women my age and projected how much money I would need for healthcare in my final years. She'd obtained quotes from moving companies and had somehow gotten preliminary estimates from real estate agents about the house's market value. The level of planning revealed how long they'd been working toward this moment. When I objected that the house held precious memories of Frank, Sarah's response shocked me with its coldness. She said Frank was gone, and that I needed to stop living in the past. Her words felt like a slap across the face, dismissing 40 years of marriage as if they meant nothing compared to her financial calculations. Marcus nodded in agreement, adding that dead people don't pay bills, with a callousness that made me flinch. The pressure tactics escalated when they brought photo albums filled with pictures of assisted living facilities. They'd actually visited several locations and taken tours without consulting me, speaking to staff about availability and pricing, as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion. Sarah had obtained applications and waiting list information, presenting it all as evidence of how much thought they'd put into solving my problem. Most manipulative of all was how they framed their arguments around concern for my safety and well-being. Sarah pointed out that I was getting older and might fall down the stairs or have a medical emergency with no one around to help. She painted vivid scenarios of me lying injured and alone, suggesting that staying in the house was essentially a death wish that would traumatize Kyle and Emma when they eventually found my body. When I firmly refused their proposal, the facade of loving concern finally cracked completely. Sarah's face hardened as she accused me of being selfish and unreasonable. She said I was making their lives unnecessarily difficult and wondered aloud why I couldn't just cooperate instead of being so damn stubborn. Marcus added that they were only trying to help and that I was being ungrateful for their efforts. The meeting ended with Sarah issuing what felt like an ultimatum. She said they couldn't keep worrying about me rattling around in such a big house, that something needed to change soon. Her tone carried an implicit threat, though she stopped short of explicitly stating consequences for continued non-compliance. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Sarah mentioned they were planning a family trip to Disney World the following week and hoped I would think seriously about their proposal while they were gone. After they left, I sat alone in Frank's chair and tried to process what had just happened. My own daughter had essentially told me that my feelings about my home didn't matter, that her financial concerns trumped my emotional needs. The realization that she saw me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected cut deeper than any grief I'd experienced since Frank's death. That night, I walked through every room of the house, touching furniture and remembering moments that Sarah dismissed as irrelevant nostalgia. This wasn't just property to be liquidated for maximum financial benefit. This was where I'd nursed Sarah through childhood illnesses, where Frank and I had celebrated anniversaries and holidays, where 3 generations of family history lived in every photograph and keepsake. The final confrontation arrived with the force of a tsunami on a grey December morning. Sarah burst through my front door without knocking, her face set in determined lines that warned me this visit would be different from all the others. Marcus followed close behind both of them, moving with purpose that made my heart rate quicken. I could sense immediately that their patience with my stubbornness had finally run out completely. Sarah began what felt like a final inspection of the property, walking through rooms with the critical eye of someone cataloguing defects. She pointed out faded curtains in the dining room, scratches on the hardwood floors from decades of family gatherings, and water stains on the ceiling from a minor leak Frank had repaired years earlier. Every imperfection became evidence in her case that I was living in deteriorating conditions that bordered on unsafe. Her commentary grew more harsh as we moved through the house. She criticized the outdated electrical outlets in the kitchen, the old-fashioned radiators that she claimed were inefficient, and the vintage fixtures that she declared fire hazards. The house that had sheltered and comforted our family for 40 years was being systematically demolished in her verbal assault, reduced to nothing more than a collection of expensive problems waiting to bankrupt me. When we reached the second floor, Sarah's criticism became more personal. She questioned my ability to safely navigate the stairs, suggested I was becoming forgetful about locking doors, and wondered aloud whether I was eating properly or maintaining basic hygiene. Her words felt designed to make me question my own competence, to internalize her belief that I was too old and frail to live independently. The worst moment came when we entered the master bedroom, the sacred space I'd shared with Frank for nearly 4 decades. This room held our most intimate memories, decorated with photographs from our wedding day vacation souvenirs, and Frank's reading chair positioned exactly where he'd left it. The scent of his cologne still lingered faintly on his pillow, which I'd never been able to wash or put away. Sarah's nose wrinkled in obvious disgust as she surveyed the space. She commented on the thick curtains that blocked harsh sunlight from Frank's sensitive eyes during his illness, the humidifier I still ran to ease my arthritis, and the dried flowers from our anniversary bouquets that I'd preserved in vases on the windowsill. To her, these weren't touching mementos of enduring love, but evidence of an old woman's inability to move forward. Then came the words that shattered something fundamental between us. Sarah looked directly at me, her expression filled with impatience and contempt, and declared that my room stinks. She said the entire house smelled like old people, and sadness that the musty odor of memories and loneliness was overwhelming. Her words hit me like physical blows, attacking not just my home, but my very essence as a human being, worthy of dignity and respect. But she wasn't finished destroying me yet. Sarah continued her verbal assault, saying I couldn't even keep the place clean anymore, that it was time to face reality about my declining abilities. She gestured dismissively at Frank's belongings that I'd lovingly maintained, calling them depressing reminders of death that any healthy person would have discarded years ago. Her cruelty felt limitless as she systematically tore down everything I held sacred. I stood frozen in the middle of our bedroom, unable to speak or defend myself against the onslaught of her disgust. This was the woman I'd raised, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose broken hearts I'd comforted, whose children I'd helped bring into the world. Yet she could look at me with such contempt, reducing my life to nothing more than an unpleasant smell that offended her refined sensibilities. As Sarah prepared to leave, she delivered what she clearly believed would be the final blow. She announced that she and Marcus were taking Kyle and Emma to Disney World for a week, giving me time to come to my senses about selling the house. When they returned, she expected a definitive answer about moving forward with their plan. The implication was clear: comply with their demands or face consequences. She hadn't yet specified, but which promised to be severe. After hearing the front door slam behind them, I remained standing in our bedroom for nearly an hour, too shocked to move or think clearly. The silence felt different now, poisoned by Sarah's words, and weighted with the realization that my own daughter saw me as nothing more than a burden to be managed. For the first time since Frank's funeral, I sat on our bed and wept. Not just for my husband's absence, but for the daughter I'd apparently lost somewhere along the way. That night marked the beginning of my transformation from victim to survivor. I lay awake until dawn, replaying every moment of Sarah's attack, and finally seeing it for what it really was: a calculated assault designed to break my resistance through shame and humiliation. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my thinking for months began to clear, replaced by a cold clarity about my situation and my options. By morning, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. If Sarah found my home so offensive, she wouldn't have to endure its presence much longer. But the solution wouldn't be what she expected. Instead of meekly surrendering to assisted living, I would take control of my destiny in a way that would teach her about consequences and respect. My first call was to Tom Harrison, the attorney who'd handled Frank's estate, and whom I trusted completely. Tom's office could see me that afternoon, and I drove there with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Frank's death. When I explained my situation, Tom's expression grew serious as he pulled out Frank's will and reviewed the property ownership details that I'd never fully understood. The revelation was staggering. Frank's will was ironclad in its provisions. The house belonged entirely to me until my death, with no legal claim available to Sarah while I remained alive. She had no right to pressure me about selling, no standing to make demands about my living situation, and absolutely no legal recourse if I chose to dispose of the property in any way I saw fit. The power I'd thought she held over me was completely illusory. Tom explained that I could sell the house immediately without Sarah's knowledge or consent, that the proceeds would be entirely mine to use as I wished, and that any threats she'd made about forcing my hand were legally meaningless. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for months suddenly lifted as I realized I held all the cards in this situation. Sarah's campaign of psychological warfare had been built on assumptions that had no basis in legal reality. Over the next 2 days, I moved with the efficiency of someone who'd finally found her direction. I contacted Barbara Chen, a real estate agent recommended by Tom, who agreed to conduct a private evaluation of the property. Her assessment exceeded my expectations. The house was worth $3.2 million due to recent market improvements and the desirability of our neighborhood for young professional families. Barbara was amazed when I told her I wanted to list the property immediately for a quick sale. She explained that homes in our price range typically took months to sell, but I was determined to move forward while Sarah was safely distracted by Disney World. Barbara agreed to an aggressive marketing strategy, targeting cash buyers who could close within days rather than weeks. While Barbara prepared the listing, I began the emotional work of sorting through 40 years of accumulated memories. I packed Frank's most precious belongings, our photo albums, and items I wanted to preserve in a storage unit across town. The process was painful, but also liberating as I separated what truly mattered from what I'd been keeping out of habit rather than love. The children's toys and books that had accumulated over years of visits went to local charities, along with furniture that held no special significance. I kept Frank's reading chair, our wedding china, and the jewelry he'd given me over the years, but released myself from the burden of maintaining everything exactly as it had been since his death. Each donated item felt like shedding weight I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had become. By Thursday, 3 different buyers had submitted offers above asking price. I chose a young couple with twin toddlers who reminded me of Sarah and Marcus 20 years earlier, full of hope and love for the family they were building. Their cash offer of $3.1 million could close the following Tuesday, just days before Sarah's return from vacation. The sale proceeded with remarkable efficiency, thanks to Barbara's connections and the buyer's eagerness to close quickly. Professional movers helped me relocate to a beautiful 2-bedroom condominium downtown, with harbour views that took my breath away. The condo was everything the mansion wasn't: modern, manageable, and filled with light rather than shadows of the past. Moving day arrived like a carefully orchestrated symphony. The new owners would take possession Tuesday afternoon, giving me just enough time to complete my transition before Sarah returned Wednesday evening. I supervised the movers with a sense of liberation I hadn't expected watching, as each box carried my life toward a future I was choosing, rather than one being imposed upon me. Barbara handled the final paperwork while I walked through the empty mansion one last time. The rooms that had echoed with Sarah's criticisms now felt peaceful in their emptiness, no longer burdened with the weight of her expectations or my grief. This house had served its purpose in my life, sheltering and sustaining me through decades of joy and sorrow. But it was time to release both of us from obligations that no longer served anyone well. I left a single envelope on the kitchen counter addressed to Sarah in my careful handwriting. Inside was a brief note explaining that I'd sold the house and moved along with my new address and phone number. I didn't justify my decision or apologize for acting without her input. After months of her treating me like an incompetent child, I communicated with the simplicity due to someone who had lost the right to detailed explanations through her own behavior. The first night in my new condo felt like stepping into a different life entirely. The harbour lights sparkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the silence was peaceful rather than lonely. My carefully chosen furniture fit perfectly in the smaller space, creating an environment that felt cozy rather than overwhelming. For the first time in years, I looked forward to tomorrow instead of dreading another day of criticism and pressure. Wednesday evening arrived with the inevitability of a tide bringing Sarah's return and the discovery that would change our relationship forever. My phone remained silent until nearly midnight, when the first call came through. I let it ring, knowing that Sarah was standing in the empty mansion, trying to process what had happened during her absence. The silence on my end was my first lesson in the power of boundaries. The second call came an hour later, followed by a text message demanding I call her back immediately. I turned off my phone and went to bed in my new bedroom with its view of the harbour, sleeping more peacefully than I had in months. Sarah could rage and panic through the night, but she would have to wait until I was ready to face the consequences of her choices. Thursday morning brought a storm of electronic fury that I weathered from the comfort of my new kitchen, sipping coffee, while watching boats navigate the harbour outside my window. Sarah had left 17 voicemails overnight, her tone progressing from confusion to anger to something approaching panic as she realized the magnitude of what had happened during her vacation. I listened to each message once, noting how her demands for explanations gradually gave way to desperate pleas for communication. When I finally answered her 18th call, Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. I hadn't heard since she was a child. She begged me to meet her at the coffee shop near her townhouse, promising she just wanted to understand what had happened. Against my better judgment, I agreed to see her that afternoon, curious about whether this crisis might finally crack through the entitlement that had poisoned our relationship. The coffee shop meeting revealed the full extent of Sarah's shock and Marcus's barely controlled rage. They arrived looking disheveled and exhausted, clearly having spent the night arguing about how to handle this unexpected development. Kyle and Emma waited in the car with their tablets, probably still confused about why their grandmother's house had vanished while they were riding roller coasters. Sarah's first words were accusations wrapped in the language of hurt feelings. She demanded to know how I could do such a thing to my own family, how I could sell the house without consulting anyone, how I could be so selfish and cruel. Her tears felt manipulative rather than genuine, designed to make me feel guilty for refusing to be the victim she'd expected me to remain. When I calmly explained that the house was mine to sell as I chose Sarah's composure, cracked completely. She screamed that I'd destroyed their future, that they'd been counting on their inheritance to solve their financial problems. The admission hung in the air like toxic smoke, finally revealing the true motivation behind months of pressure to move me into assisted living. Marcus, perhaps realizing Sarah had said too much, tried to backtrack by claiming they'd only wanted what was best for me. But his slip about needing the inheritance money to pay off their debts exposed the lie beneath their concern. They hadn't been trying to rescue me from an unsuitable living situation. They'd been positioning themselves to benefit financially from my displacement. Sarah's breakdown continued as she realized that their carefully laid plans had not only failed, but backfired spectacularly. Instead of inheriting millions, they were still stuck in their cramped townhouse with mounting debt and no immediate prospects for improvement. Her anguish felt satisfying in a way that probably made me a terrible person. But I'd earned this moment of vindication through months of psychological torture. The community's reaction to our drama provided an unexpected source of entertainment over the following weeks. News travels fast in small towns, and Sarah's public meltdown at the coffee shop had been witnessed by several neighbors. Phone calls from concerned friends revealed that Sarah had been telling people I was becoming senile and incompetent, setting the stage for what she'd hoped would be a sympathetic narrative about adult children forced to make difficult decisions for aging parents. Instead, my decisive action and obvious competence in handling the sale exposed her manipulation for what it was. Public opinion shifted dramatically as people realized I'd outmaneuvered my own daughter rather than succumbing to elder abuse. The sympathy Sarah had been cultivating for months evaporated overnight, replaced by whispered judgments about her greed and disrespect for her mother. A full year passed before Sarah finally reached out with what sounded like genuine remorse rather than strategic manipulation. Her call came on a Tuesday evening as I was preparing dinner in my beautiful kitchen, and her voice carried a humility I hadn't heard since she was small. She asked if we could meet to talk, not to argue or negotiate, but to try rebuilding what we'd lost through her choices and my response to them. The intervening months had been transformative for both of us in different ways. I'd discovered a capacity for independence and joy that I'd forgotten I possessed. My condo became a sanctuary where I entertained new friends from the building's social committee, hosted book club meetings, and volunteered with literacy programs downtown. The money from the house sale allowed me to travel, donate generously to causes I cared about, and live comfortably without financial anxiety. Sarah's year had been considerably more challenging. Through mutual friends, I'd learned that her marriage was strained by financial pressure and the humiliation of their failed inheritance grab. Marcus had found work, but at a significant pay reduction, forcing them to make sacrifices and lifestyle changes they'd hoped to avoid. The children, now 13 and 10, had grown more independent and less willing to be used as emotional weapons against their grandmother. When we finally met for lunch at a quiet restaurant downtown, Sarah looked older and somehow smaller than I remembered. She began with an apology that felt genuine rather than strategic, acknowledging that she'd treated me terribly and lost sight of what family relationships should be. Her words carried a weight of genuine regret rather than the calculated manipulation I'd grown accustomed to hearing from her. But I wasn't ready to simply forget the months of psychological abuse she'd inflicted. My forgiveness, if it came at all, would require more than words and tears. I explained that rebuilding our relationship would happen slowly with clear boundaries about what behavior I would and wouldn't accept. She would need to prove through consistent actions that she respected me as an autonomous adult rather than viewing me as a resource to be managed. The process of reconciliation took nearly 6 more months of carefully supervised meetings and phone calls. Sarah had to learn to relate to me as an equal rather than a problem to be solved. She had to accept that my decisions about my life and money were mine alone, to make that her opinion would be welcomed but not determinative. Most importantly, she had to demonstrate genuine remorse for the cruelty she'd shown, rather than just regret for its consequences. Kyle and Emma were the bridge that ultimately made forgiveness possible. They'd missed their grandmother more than anyone had anticipated, and their genuine affection helped soften the hardness that had grown around my heart. Watching Sarah struggle to explain why they couldn't visit me for months had apparently been one of the most painful consequences of her choices, forcing her to confront how her greed had damaged innocent relationships. Our new relationship bears little resemblance to what we'd had before. Sarah no longer takes my love for granted, or assumes she knows what's best for me. She asks about my life with genuine interest rather than calculation, and she's learned to accept my choices, even when they differ from what she might prefer. The dynamic is healthier, but less intimate, built on mutual respect rather than unconditional maternal devotion. The children visit me monthly now, delighting in my harbour view and the freedom to explore downtown while staying with me. They've grown into thoughtful young people who seem to understand that their grandmother made a difficult choice about dignity and respect. Their presence fills my condo with the laughter and energy that makes family relationships worthwhile when they're built on foundation of mutual caring rather than obligation. Through this experience, I learned that love doesn't require accepting mistreatment, that setting boundaries strengthens relationships rather than destroying them. I discovered that being alone isn't the same as being lonely, that choosing solitude can be empowering rather than defeating. Most importantly, I realized that my worth as a person wasn't determined by how others chose to treat me, but by how I allowed them to treat me. The inheritance Sarah had taken for granted became the instrument of her education about respect and consequences. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for adult children is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when the process is painful for everyone involved. Sometimes you have to lose someone to find yourself, and sometimes you have to teach others how to lose you before they can learn how to truly love you. My final reflection on this chapter of my life comes with the wisdom that suffering can be transformative if we're brave enough to let it change us rather than simply endure it. Sarah learned that family relationships require nurturing and respect rather than assumptions and entitlement. I learned that I was stronger and more capable than I'd believed, that starting over at 64 was challenging, but not impossible. The mansion is gone, but the memories I chose to keep live on in photo albums and keepsakes that fit perfectly in my new life. Frank's presence isn't diminished by changing locations. His love travels with me wherever I go. And Sarah's respect, hard-won through conflict and forgiveness, means more now than the automatic deference I'd accepted before, because it's been earned rather than assumed. If you're facing family members who've forgotten that love requires respect, remember that your self-worth isn't determined by their treatment of you. Sometimes the best inheritance you can give your children isn't money, but the lesson that dignity matters more than financial security, that relationships must be earned rather than inherited. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach others the consequences of taking you for granted. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story in the comments below. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who took your love for granted? How did you find the courage to choose dignity over peace? Please like this video. If it resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your power. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it gives you courage to write your own ending when life demands that you choose between being loved and being respected. May you always choose respect, because real love includes respect, and anything less isn't worth keeping.